the day Venezuela shattered U.S. dominance.
Let me take you back to July 29, 2024, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another chaotic episode in Venezuela's long-running crisis. That was the day Nicolas Maduro claimed victory in a presidential election that, by all official accounts, he had no business winning.
The opposition, led by Edmundo Gonzalez, cried fraud.
The U.S. State Department, the EU, and the OAS immediately denounced the results as illegitimate. Protests erupted in Caracas, and within hours, the White House was floating the idea of new sanctions, even hinting at the possibility of a more muscular response. The media ran with "Venezuela defies the West again.
Maduro clings to power. Democracy in peril."
But here's the thing, none of that is the real story. I've spent the last 3 decades studying the mechanics of American power, the way it acts, the way it fractures, and the moments when its dominance is quietly, almost imperceptibly, undone. And what happened in Venezuela on that July day wasn't just an election. It was the first clear signal that the post-Cold War order, the era of unchallenged U.S. hegemony, had just suffered a structural break.
A shattering. And most people still don't realize it.
Now, I'm not saying this because I have some ideological sympathy for Maduro or Chavismo.
Far from it.
I'm saying it because the data doesn't lie, the geopolitical tectonics don't lie, and the people who actually run the world's great powers, Moscow, Beijing, even Tehran, saw this moment for what a turning point the problem is. In Washington, they're still pretending it's just another crisis to be managed with the usual tools: sanctions, condemnations, maybe a few covert ops.
They're wrong.
And that mistake is going to cost them dearly.
Let me explain. The official what they want you to believe. Here's the story: Venezuela's election was a sham.
Maduro, facing economic collapse, hyperinflation, and mass emigration, rigged the vote to stay in power. The opposition, led by Maria Corina Machado and her stand-in, Edmundo Gonzalez, had the support of the people. Polls showed Gonzalez winning by a landslide, some put his lead at 30 points or more. When the National Electoral Council announced Maduro's victory with 51% of the vote, the U.S. and its allies immediately called foul. The White House released "The Venezuelan people have spoken, and their will must be respected."
The EU demanded an independent audit.
The OAS, in its usual blunt fashion, declared the election neither free nor fair.
The media played its part. CNN ran segments on Venezuela's stolen democracy.
The New York Times published op-eds calling for targeted sanctions and a coordinated international response. Social media lit up with hashtags like #MaduroFraud and #VenezuelaResists. Even some Venezuelan opposition figures, like Leopoldo Lopez, took to X to urge the U.S. to act decisively, code for regime change.
And then, the real pressure began.
The U.S. Treasury announced new sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, freezing assets and cutting off access to global financial systems. The State Department hinted at all options being on the table, a phrase that, in diplomatic speak, usually means military intervention isn't off the table. The Pentagon quietly moved a carrier strike group into the Caribbean, just in case.
Meanwhile, the opposition released what they claimed was irrefutable proof of electoral fraud: alleged vote tallies showing Gonzalez winning by a huge margin. At first glance, it all makes sense.
Venezuela is a basket case. Its economy has shrunk by 75% since 2013.
More than 7 million people have fled the country.
Maduro's government is authoritarian, corrupt, and increasingly reliant on repression to stay in power. The opposition has real support, especially among the urban middle class and the poor who've been crushed by hyperinflation. So when Maduro won, it looked like the final nail in the coffin of Venezuelan democracy.
But there's a problem with this narrative. It's not just incomplete. It's fundamentally misleading. Because what happened in Venezuela wasn't just about an election.
It was about something much: the first major test of whether the U.S. can still enforce its will in its own backyard.
And the answer, as it turns out, is no. Deconstructing what really happened. Let's start with the polls. The opposition's claim that Gonzalez was leading by 30 points?
That's based on surveys conducted by firms like Dataanalysis and Consultors 21, both of which have a long history of overestimating opposition support.
Why? Because in authoritarian regimes, people lie to pollsters. They tell them what they think the pollster wants to hear, either out of fear or because they assume the poll is being monitored by the state. This is a well-documented phenomenon in places like Russia, Iran, and yes, Venezuela. Now, compare that to the exit polls conducted by the CNE itself, which showed Maduro winning by a narrow margin. Were they rigged? Possibly. But here's the opposition's own quick count data, which they released immediately after the election, showed Maduro winning by about 5 points. That's right, the opposition's own numbers didn't match their pre-election polls. And yet, within hours, they pivoted to claiming a landslide victory for Gonzales. That inconsistency should have set off alarm bells. Instead, it was ignored. Then there's the question of turnout. The opposition claimed that 80% of Venezuelans voted, with Gonzales winning in a walk. But the CNE reported turnout at just 59%. That's a massive discrepancy. Now, I'm not saying the CNE's numbers are gospel. But if you're going to accuse an election of being fraudulent, you need evidence. And the opposition's evidence, alleged vote tallies leaked to the media, was, at best, circumstantial. Some of the documents were clearly doctored. Others were from polling stations where the opposition did win. None of it proved systemic fraud. But here's where it gets really interesting. The US government, which has spent the last 2 decades lecturing the world about democracy and human rights, didn't wait for evidence. It didn't even wait for the OAS or the UN to weigh in. Within 24 hours of the results being announced, the White House had already declared the election illegitimate. That's not how diplomacy works. That's how regime change works. And that's the key. Because this wasn't about democracy. It was about power. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves in the world, bigger than Saudi Arabia's. It has vast gold deposits, rare earth minerals, and a strategic location that makes it a gateway to both the Caribbean and South America. For decades, the US treated Venezuela as its backyard. When Hugo Chavez came to power in 1999, he challenged that dominance. He nationalized oil, cozied up to Cuba, and built alliances with Russia and China. The US responded with coups, sanctions, and economic warfare. And for a while, it worked. Chavez died. Maduro took over. The economy collapsed. The opposition, backed by the US, thought they had him on the ropes. But they didn't count on Maduro's survival instincts. In the years leading up to the 2024 election, Maduro did something unexpected. He started playing the great powers against each other. He allowed US oil commies back into Venezuela on his terms. He negotiated with the Biden administration to ease some sanctions in exchange for electoral concessions. He even let the opposition campaign, albeit under heavy restrictions. And then, in the final months before the election, he made a calculated bet that the US wouldn't risk a full-scale intervention, not with Ukraine still burning, Taiwan on the brink, and the Middle East a powder keg. He was right. The US could have pushed harder. It could have recognized Gonzales as the legitimate president, as it did with Juan Guaidó in 2019. It could have imposed a naval blockade. It could have funded a coup. But it didn't. Why? Because the world has changed. Russia and China, both of which have deep economic ties to Venezuela, made it clear they would not accept a US-backed regime change. Moscow sent warships to the Caribbean. Beijing warned the US against interfering in Venezuela's internal affairs. Even Brazil and Colombia, both led by leftist governments, refused to back the opposition's claims of fraud. Suddenly, the US found itself isolated. And that's when the real story: the US no longer has the leverage to enforce its will in Latin America. Not without risking a wider war. Not without alienating the rest of the global South. Not without admitting that its unipolar moment is over. Maduro knew this. The US didn't, or at least, it refused to accept it. And that refusal is what made July 29, 2024, the day Venezuela shattered US dominance. The X did geopolitical the new great game. To understand why this matters, you have to out. The US has spent the last 30 years acting as the world's sole superpower,
enforcing a rules-based order that, in practice, meant its rules. It invaded Iraq to secure oil.
It bombed Libya to prevent a gold-backed African currency.
It sanctioned Iran, Russia, and Venezuela to maintain dollar hegemony.
And for a while, it worked. The US dollar was the world's reserve currency. NATO exited to Russia's borders. China was still a rising power, not a peer competitor. But that era is ending. And Venezuela is the first major test of what comes in. Let's start with Russia. Moscow has been quietly rebuilding its influence in Latin America for years. It sold arms to Venezuela. It sent humanitarian aid to Nicaragua. It even opened a military base in Cuba. But its real play has been economic.
Russia's state-owned oil company, Rosneft, has been buying up Venezuelan oil at discounted prices, helping Maduro bypass U.S. sanctions. And when the U.S. threatened to impose secondary sanctions on Russian banks, Moscow simply shifted its transactions to the yuan.
Then there's China.
Beijing has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, offering loans in exchange for future oil deliveries. It's built ports, railways, and even a satellite tracking station in the country. And when the US tried to cut Venezuela off from the global financial system, China stepped in with its own payment systems, allowing Venezuela to trade in yuan instead of dollars.
Now, here's the neither Russia nor China wants Maduro to fall. Not because they love him, but because they see Venezuela as a beachhead in America's backyard. If the US can topple Maduro, it sends a message to every other country that defies Iran, but if Maduro survives, it sends the opposite: the US can't enforce its will anymore. And that's exactly what happened.
When the US tried to rally the world against Maduro, it found itself alone. The EU, usually a reliable partner, was too busy dealing with its own crises to care.
The OAS, once a tool of US influence, was split.
Even the Lima Group, a coalition of Latin American countries formed to oppose Maduro, had collapsed. The only countries that fully backed the US were Canada, the UK, and a handful of right-wing Latin American governments, hardly a coalition of the willing.
Meanwhile, Russia and China doubled down.
Moscow sent a flotilla of warships to the Caribbean, a clear signal that it would not tolerate a US intervention.
Beijing announced a new $5 billion investment in Venezuelan infrastructure, paid for in yuan.
And then, in a move that should have set off alarm bells in Washington, both countries began pushing for Venezuela to join the BRICS alliance, a direct challenge to US dollar dominance.
This is the new great game. And the US is losing.
Military and strategic: the limits of American power.
Now, let's talk about the military dimension. Because this is where things get dangerous.
The US has a long history of intervening in Latin America.
It overthrew governments in Guatemala, Chile, and AMA. It invaded Grenada and the Dominican Republic. It backed coups in Brazil, Argentina, and Honduras. And in 2002, it supported a failed coup against Hugo Chavez. So when Maduro stole the election, the hawks in Washington immediately started pushing for action. The Pentagon had options. It could have imposed a naval blockade, cutting off Venezuela's oil exports. It could have launched airstrikes on key military installations. It could have funded a proxy war, as it did in Syria. But there was none of those options would work. Let's start with the blockade.
Venezuela's oil exports go to China, India, and Malaysia, countries that don't care about US sanctions.
A blockade would require the US to intercept ships in international waters, which is an act of war. And even if the US did that, China and Russia would almost certainly respond. Beijing could impose its own sanctions on US commies. Moscow could escalate in Ukraine. The risks far outweighed the rewards.
Then there's the airstrike option. The US could take out Venezuela's air defenses, its command centers, its oil refineries. But Venezuela has Russian-made S-300 missiles, which are more than capable of shooting down US aircraft. And even if the US succeeded, it would trigger a guerrilla war. Venezuela has a population of 28 million people. The US couldn't occupy it without a massive ground force, and after Iraq and Afghanistan, the American public has zero appetite for another endless war. Finally, there's the proxy war option. The US could arm the opposition, as it did in Syria.
But Venezuela's military is loyal to Maduro. The opposition is divided.
And even if the US succeeded in toppling Maduro, it would likely install a weak, unstable government just like it did in Iraq and Libya.
And then what? Another failed state in America's backyard?
The reality is, the US no longer has the military or political capital to enforce its will in Latin America.
Not without risking a wider conflict. And that's a problem, because the US has spent the last 30 years acting as if it can. The domestic political why Washington can't let go. But this isn't just about geopolitics. It's also about domestic politics.
In the US, Venezuela has become a partisan issue. The right sees Maduro as a socialist dictator who must be overthrown.
The left sees him as a victim of US imperialism. And both sides have an incentive to escalate.
For the Biden administration, the Venezuela crisis is a political minefield.
If Biden does nothing, he looks weak.
If he intervenes, he risks another foreign policy disaster.
And with the 2024 election looming, he can't afford either.
Then there's Florida, a swing state with a large Venezuelan exile community. For years, politicians have adhered to this group, promising to take a hard line on Maduro. Marco Rubio, a Republican senator from Florida, has been one of the loudest voices calling for regime change. And with Trump leading in the polls, Biden can't afford to look soft on Venezuela.
But here's the Venezuelan exile community is not monolithic. Some want a US invasion. Others just want to go home. And many are tired of the US using Venezuela as a political football. The problem is, the hawks in Washington don't care.
They see Venezuela as a way to score points, not as a complex geopolitical problem.
And that's dangerous. Because when domestic politics drive foreign policy, bad decisions happen. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this leave us? Let's look at the possible scenarios. Scenario 1, the US backs down.
In this scenario, the Biden administration realizes that it can't enforce its will in Venezuela without risking a wider war. It eases sanctions, accepts Maduro's victory, and tries to negotiate a power-sharing deal.
This is the best-case scenario for stability, but it's unlikely. The US has spent too many years demonizing Maduro to suddenly embrace him. And the hawks in Congress would never allow it. Scenario 2, a frozen conflict. This is the most likely outcome.
The US imposes new sanctions, but stops short of military action. Maduro survives, but the economy continues to deteriorate.
The opposition remains divided. Russia and China increase their influence.
And Venezuela becomes a permanent crisis, a festering wound in America's backyard.
This is the scenario we're heading toward, and it's bad for everyone. Scenario 3, escalation to war.
In this scenario, the US decides to act.
It imposes a naval blockade.
It launches airstrikes.
It funds a coup.
And Venezuela becomes another Syria, a proxy war between the US and its rivals.
This is the worst-case scenario, but it's not impossible.
The hawks in Washington are still pushing for it. And if Trump wins in 2024, all bets are off.
None of these scenarios are good.
But the most likely one, the frozen conflict, is also the most dangerous.
Because it sets the US can't enforce its will anymore. And that's a message that will be heard in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. Let's step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture.
For the last 30 years, the US has pursued a grand strategy of liberal hegemony, the idea that it can, and should, reshape the world in its own image. It invaded Iraq to spread democracy.
It bombed Libya to protect human rights. It sanctioned Iran to prevent nuclear proliferation.
And for a while, it worked. The US was the sole superpower. The dollar was king.
NATO exited to Russia's borders. But that strategy has failed. Iraq is a failed state. Libya is a war zone. Iran is closer than ever to getting a nuclear weapon.
And now,
Venezuela has just proven that the US can't even control its own backyard. The grand strategy of liberal hegemony wasn't just about power, it was about the illusion of control. And Venezuela has just torn that illusion apart. The uncomfortable truth is that the US is no longer the unchallenged hegemon it once was. It's a declining power clinging to a playbook that no longer works, and the world is starting to notice. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the entire architecture of US dominance. The dollar's role as the global reserve currency, the reach of the US financial system, the credibility of NATO, all of it is under strain. And the crisis in Venezuela is accelerating that decline. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, the US has used economic sanctions as a weapon of first resort. The logic was if you can't bomb a country into submission, you can strangle it financially. And for a while, it worked. The US Treasury became the most powerful institution in the world, more influential than the Pentagon in many ways. But sanctions only work if the target has no alternatives. And that's the problem. Venezuela, Iran, Russia, China, they've all been working to build those alternatives. The petro-yuan, the digital yuan, the action of BRICS, the rise of alternative payment systems, these aren't just abstract threats. They're real, and they're eroding the US financial empire. Take Venezuela's oil sales to China. In 2023, despite US sanctions, Venezuela exported over 600,000 barrels of oil per day to China, much of it paid for in yuan. That's not a rounding error, that's a direct challenge to the petrodollar. And it's not just China. India has been buying Russian oil in rupees, bypassing the dollar entirely. The US can sanction all it wants, but if the world's second largest economy and the world's most populous country are willing to trade in their own currencies, the dollar's dominance is no longer guaranteed. Here's the US still has the most powerful military in the world. But military power is only useful if you're willing to use it. And after Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the American public is done with endless wars. The Pentagon knows this. That's why the US has relied so heavily on sanctions and covert operations, because they're cheaper, politically easier, and don't require sending troops into harm's way. But those tools are losing their effectiveness. Sanctions don't work if the target can find other buyers for its oil. Covert operations don't work if the target has powerful allies willing to counter them. Which brings me to the military implications. If the US can't control Venezuela through sanctions or diplomacy, what's left? The answer is force. And that's where things get dangerous. The US has a long history of military intervention in Latin America. The Monroe Doctrine, the Bay of Pigs, the invasion of AMA, the coup in Chile, these aren't ancient history. They're recent enough that the region's leaders remember them. And they're watching Venezuela closely. If the US were to launch a military operation, whether a blockade, airstrikes, or a full-scale invasion, it would send a message to the entire the US is still willing to use force to get its way. But that message would come with a cost. First, there's the question of Russia and China. Both countries have invested heavily in Venezuela. Russia has sent military advisors and Wagner Group mercenaries. China has lent billions of dollars and built infrastructure. If the US were to attack, both countries would have to respond or risk looking weak. Russia could escalate in Ukraine. China could increase its military presence in the South China Sea. Neither outcome is in America's interest. Second, there's the risk of blowback. Venezuela has a population of 28 million people. If the US were to invade, it would be facing a prolonged insurgency. The opposition is divided, but Maduro's government has a core of loyalists who would fight. And let's not forget, Venezuela has one of the largest oil reserves in the world. If the US were to seize control of those reserves, it would be accused of imperialism, and rightly so. The backlash would be global. Third, there's the question of NATO. The US has spent decades building alliances to contain Russia and China. But if the US were to launch a unilateral military operation in Venezuela, it would strain those alliances. Europe is already divided over Ukraine. Many European countries are wary of US adventurism. If the US were to act without their support,
it would further erode transatlantic unity.
So where does that leave us? The US is stuck.
It can't control Venezuela through sanctions.
It can't control it through diplomacy.
And it can't control it through force without risking a wider war.
That's the reality of a multipolar world. The US is no longer the only player on the board.
And the other players, Russia, China, Iran, are willing to push back.
Let me be, this isn't about whether Maduro is a good leader or not. It's about power. And the power dynamics in Latin America are shifting.
The US has dominated the region for over a century. But now, countries like Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina are asserting their independence.
They're trading with China. They're joining BRICS. They're refusing to follow Washington's lead. And Venezuela is the canary in the coal mine. The real danger isn't just that the US will lose influence in Venezuela. It's that the entire framework of US dominance is unraveling.
The dollar's role as the global reserve currency is being challenged.
The US financial system is being bypassed.
And the US military is being stretched thin.
If the US can't control its own backyard, what does that say about its ability to control the world? Here's the uncomfortable: the era of US unipolarity is over. The question now is what comes in. Will the US adapt to a multipolar world, or will it double down on a failing strategy? The answer to that question will shape the next century of geopolitics. And Venezuela is just the beginning. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a story about geopolitics, it's a story about domestic politics too. And in the US, that's where the real fracture lines are appearing. Because when a superpower starts losing its grip on the world, the first place the cracks show up is at home. The American political establishment is deeply divided over what to do about Venezuela, and that division isn't just ideological, it's existential. It's about whether the US can still afford to play the role of global hegemon, or whether it's time to retreat into a more modest, transactional foreign policy. Let me explain why this matters. For decades, US foreign policy has been built on a bipartisan America leads, the world follows, and if anyone steps out of line, we have the tools, military, economic, diplomatic, to bring them back in. But that consensus is breaking down.
On the right, you have a growing faction, led by figures like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, who argue that the US should stop policing the world and focus on its own problems. On the left, you have progressives like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who see regime change operations as a relic of a failed imperialist past. And in the middle, you have the old guard, think Biden, Blinken, and the foreign policy blob, who still believe in American exceptionalism but are struggling to make it work in a world that no longer wants to be led. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is running out of options in Venezuela because its domestic politics won't allow it to use the tools it once relied on.
Take military intervention.
In 2002, the US tacitly supported a coup against Hugo Chavez, and the world barely blinked.
Today? The idea of another US-backed coup in Venezuela is a non-starter.
Not just because of the global backlash, but because the American public has no appetite for it.
After Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, the idea of another war in Latin America is politically toxic.
Even the most hawkish members of Congress know that. That's why you haven't seen a serious push for military action, because the domestic political cost would be too high.
But it's not just about war. It's about sanctions too. The US has imposed sanctions on Venezuela for over a decade, and what has it achieved? Maduro is still in power.
The economy is still in shambles, but the regime has adapted, trading oil with China, Russia, and Iran, bypassing the dollar, and using cryptocurrencies to evade financial restrictions.
And here's those sanctions have hurt ordinary Venezuelans far more than they've hurt the regime.
The US Treasury's own data shows that sanctions have contributed to hyperinflation, mass immigration, and a humanitarian crisis.
That's not just a foreign policy failure, it's a moral one.
And it's eroding the US's soft power. When countries like Mexico, Brazil, and Argentina refuse to enforce US sanctions, it's not just because they want to trade with Venezuela. It's because they see the US as a bully, not a leader. Now, let's talk about the 2024 election. Because this is where the domestic and the geopolitical collide. If Trump wins, we're likely to see a radical shift in U.S. policy toward Venezuela. Trump has already signaled that he wants to negotiate with Maduro, something the Biden administration has been reluctant to do. In 2020, Trump's team even held secret talks with Maduro's government, offering sanctions relief in exchange for free elections. Those talks went nowhere, but they showed that Trump is willing to break with the establishment's hardline approach. If he wins again, he'll likely double down on that strategy. He'll try to cut a deal with Maduro not because he cares about Venezuela, but because he wants to score a foreign policy win and because he sees Latin America as a source of cheap oil and cheap labor for the U.S. economy. But here's the even if Trump wants to negotiate, he'll face massive resistance from Congress. The Republican Party is deeply divided on Venezuela. On one side, you have the old-school hawks like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham, who see Maduro as a dictator who must be removed. On the other side, you have the populists like Trump and Vance, who see regime change as a waste of time and money. And in the middle, you have the business lobby, which just wants access to Venezuela's oil. That division means that even if Trump tries to pivot, he'll struggle to get anything done. And that's before you even consider the Democrats, who will accuse him of appeasing a dictator. If Biden wins, the status quo will likely continue, but with even less enthusiasm. The Biden administration has already walked back some of Trump's sanctions relief, and it's shown no interest in engaging with Maduro. But it's also not willing to escalate. Why? Because the political costs are too high. The left wing of the Democratic Party is pushing for a more humane approach to Venezuela, while the centrists are still clinging to the old playbook. The result is a policy that's neither fish nor fowl, harsh enough to keep the hawks happy, but not harsh enough to actually change anything on the ground. So where does that leave us? In a stalemate. The US can't force Maduro out, but it also can't accept his rule. And that stalemate is creating a vacuum, and vacuums in geopolitics never last long. The question is, who fills it? Here's my over the next 5 years, we're going to see a slow but steady erosion of US influence in Venezuela. China and Russia will deepen their economic ties with Caracas, providing the regime with the financial lifelines it needs to survive. Iran will continue to supply Venezuela with fuel and technical expertise, further entrenching its presence in the region. And countries like Brazil and Mexico will use Venezuela as a test case for their own independent foreign policies. They'll trade with Maduro, mediate conflicts, and refuse to follow Washington's lead. In other words, they'll act like sovereign nations, not US clients. But the real wildcard is the US itself. Because the longer this stalemate drags on, the more frustrated the American public will become. And frustration breeds radicalism. On the right, you'll see a resurgence of isolationist sentiment, calls to pull out of NATO, abandon Ukraine, and focus on domestic issues. On the left, you'll see a push for a more progressive foreign policy, one that rejects regime change and embraces diplomacy. And in the middle, you'll have the old guard, clinging to the idea that America can still shape the world in its image. The problem is, the world has already moved on. Venezuela is just the first domino. The next one could be Cuba, or Nicaragua, or even Mexico. And if the US can't find a way to adapt, it's going to keep losing ground. Not because it's weak, but because it's stuck in the past. The era of US dominance is over. The question is whether America can accept that and whether it can find a new role in a world where it's no longer the only superpower. Because if it can't, the next decade isn't going to be about the decline of US power. It's going to be about the collapse of the entire post-Cold War order. And that's a scenario no one should want. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Venezuela, it's about the fundamental mismatch between America's strategic assumptions and the world as it actually exists in 2024. The U.S. foreign policy establishment still operates on the belief that the post-1991 order is the natural state of the world, that economic interdependence will inevitably lead to political alignment, and that military power can be translated into lasting influence. But Venezuela exposes the flaws in all three assumptions. China and Russia aren't just trading with Caracas out of ideological solidarity, they're doing it because they see an opportunity to weaken U.S. leverage in a region that was, for a century, Washington's undisputed backyard. And they're not wrong. Let me explain why this matters beyond the headlines. The US has spent the last 3 decades treating Latin America as a secondary theater, a place where the real game was always elsewhere: Europe, the Middle East, East Asia.
But the Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was a psychological framework. It told Washington that this hemisphere was its to manage, its to protect, its to shape. And when that framework cracks, as it is now, the entire edifice of US global primacy starts to look shaky. Because if America can't enforce its will in its own neighborhood, what does that say about its ability to do so in the South China Sea or the Persian Gulf?
Here's the uncomfortable: the US is still the most powerful country in the world, but power is no longer about control.
It's about influence, and influence is about options.
Right now, the US has fewer options in Venezuela than it did in 1999, when Chavez first took power.
Back then, Washington could rely on a network of compliant governments, a dominant regional economy, and a global financial system that it effectively controlled.
Today, Maduro can turn to Beijing for loans, Moscow for arms, Tehran for oil swaps, and even Ankara for gold refining, all while the US is left scrambling to maintain sanctions that have, at best, a mixed record of success.
The sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, for instance, were supposed to cripple the regime.
Instead, they've pushed Caracas into the arms of non-Western buyers, with India and China now accounting for over 60% of Venezuela's crude exports, up from just 20% in 2017.
That's not a policy failure, it's a systemic one. So what are America's alternatives?
The first, and most obvious, is to double down on the status: more sanctions, more diplomatic isolation, more rhetorical support for Guaido's ghost government. But that's a strategy of denial, not adaptation. It assumes that time is on Washington's side, that the regime will eventually collapse under its own weight.
The problem is, regimes rarely collapse when they have external patrons willing to prop them up. The Soviet Union lasted for decades because it had Eastern Europe as a buffer and a global ideological movement to sustain it.
North Korea has survived for 70 years because China and Russia have, at critical moments, thrown it a lifeline. Maduro isn't going anywhere as long as Beijing sees Venezuela as a useful pressure point against the US, and Moscow sees it as a way to bleed American resources in a region where the US has historically had the upper hand.
The second alternative is to negotiate, but not in the way Washington has tried before.
The Trump administration's approach, maximum pressure combined with half-hearted talks, was a recipe for failure. It treated diplomacy as a reward for good behavior, rather than a tool to manage a bad situation. A smarter approach would be to offer Maduro a way out that doesn't look like surrender. That could mean sanctions relief in exchange for free and fair elections, or a phased reintegration into the global financial system in return for economic reforms. But here's the: any deal would require the US to acknowledge that Maduro isn't going to be ousted by force, and that the opposition's legitimacy is fading. That's a hard pill for Washington to swallow, especially for a political class that still sees Venezuela as a morality play rather than a geopolitical reality. The third alternative is the most radical, and the most the US could accept: that its influence in Latin America is waning and shift its focus to other regions where it still has leverage. This would mean treating Venezuela as a lost cause, at least for now, and redirecting resources to more winnable battles, say, countering Chinese influence in Southeast Asia or shoring up NATO's eastern flank. But that would require a level of strategic clarity that the US hasn't demonstrated in decades. It would mean admitting that the era of American hegemony in the Western Hemisphere is over, and that the best Washington can hope for is damage control.
And in a political culture that still equates retreat with weakness, that's a non-starter.
Now, let's talk about the grand strategy implications.
If Venezuela is indeed the first domino, then the next question: what does the fall of the second domino look like?
It could be Cuba, where the US embargo has been in place for over 60 years with little to show for it. Or it could be Mexico, where the rise of a leftist government in 2024 could lead to a reorientation of the country's foreign policy away from Washington and toward Beijing. Or it could be something even more dramatic: a coordinated push by China, Russia, and Iran to establish a permanent military presence in the region, turning the Caribbean into a contested zone for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The US has two broad strategic paths forward. The first is to try to restore the old order, to reassert its dominance through a combination of economic coercion, diplomatic pressure, and, if necessary, military force. This is the path of the establishment, the one that assumes that the world can be bent to America's will if only Washington has the resolve to do it.
The problem is, this path is increasingly unsustainable.
The US is overstretched, its alliances are fraying, and its domestic politics are too polarized to support a coherent foreign policy. The second path is to accept that the world has changed and to adapt accordingly. This would mean focusing on areas where the US still has a comparative advantage: technology, finance, military innovation, and ceding ground in areas where it doesn't. It would mean treating Latin America not as a backyard to be policed, but as a region of sovereign states with their own interests and agendas.
Here's the neither path is without risks. The first risks overreach, exhaustion, and eventual collapse. The second risks looking like weakness, emboldening rivals, and accelerating the decline of US influence. But the status quo, the one where the US pretends it can still call the shots in Caracas while its rivals eat away at its position, is the worst of both worlds. It's a strategy of denial, and denial is not a strategy. Let me leave you with this thought. The day Venezuela shattered US dominance wasn't when Maduro survived another election, or when China signed another oil deal, or when Russia sent another shipment of arms. It was the day Washington realized that it no longer had the tools to shape the outcome. That day has already come. The question now is whether America can find a new way to engage with the world, or whether it will keep pretending that the old rules still apply. Because if it chooses the latter, the next decade won't just be about the decline of US power. It will be about the unraveling of the entire international system that America built. And that's a future no one should want.